Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for some. Some of you I know, and some may know me. My name is Jessica Iveson, and I work with the Deline Gotine government. Born and raised in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, member of the land claim for the Sahtu region, as well as a member of Deline, the First Nation, the Final Self-Government Agreement member. I worked, in Indigenous law for a number of years at OKT and Gowlings before that, and then went off to practice briefly for myself for a bit. And since 2016 or so, I've been working largely on consulting when it comes to implementation of self-government, largely with LNA. But here I'm asked to talk about implementing a membership database in the community, which is no small feat. And we've also invited Lawrence Lewis with One Feather. And if you're able to give yourself a bit of a quick intro, that would be helpful.
Yeah, Gilakesta, Gukamayam, Scott Lally's, Wee Nation of Vancouver Island. My name is Lawrence Lewis. I'm the CEO and founder of One Feather. And I'm from the Wee Nation on Vancouver Island. My Indigenous name is Lally's. And it's my pleasure to be here today and tell you a little bit about One Feather and what we've done to support this initiative when the time comes. So thank you again. Back to you, Jessica.
Thank you. Can we flip to the next slide, please? So as you do, we have a bit of a table of contents. So we're going to talk really briefly about who Deline is, talk about why we wanted to get a membership database in place, wanted to talk about, how we wanted to use it, to selecting a vendor, actually doing the work of determining who members are, and what are we tracking about those members, and talking about how we actually got to collecting data towards the end there before we actually put the thing in place, and then following that up with his own presentation after. Next slide, please. So who is Deline? It is one of two self-governing Indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories. It is found in the Sahtu region of the NWT, along with 4 other communities, some of which are actually currently negotiating their self-government agreements as well. The population in community, let's say, is around 600 or so, and outside of the community is over 600. It's a fly-in community, so it's quite remote. There's about 6 weeks of the year where we do have a winter road access, but that time frame is actually shrinking with every year, which is scary. And I think I really want to note here, because it's important later, is that Deline is a bit unique. We're all unique, but Deline is a bit different in that it is both an Indigenous government and a public government in some respects. So that'll be important for later when we start talking about membership. Next slide, please. The next slide, if possible. So why did we want to put a database in place for membership? Back in 2016, September, is when our self-government agreement came into effect. So prior to that date, we had 3 different entities that were sort of operating in the community. We had a land claim body, the Deline Land Corporation. We had the First Nation, Deline First Nation, like an Indian Act body. And then we also had the Charter Community of Deline, which was a municipal body. And so these different groups in the community were tracking different things. So beneficiaries of the land claim for one, band members under the Indian Act for another, and then also residents for the municipal aspect of things. So come effective date, all of those entities dissolved, and we became one unified government that took on the role of all of those groups. And so at that time, then our membership database was really just a series of Excel spreadsheets that were, found in various places that had different variations depending on the use of the year. So you might have, who are band members ages 0 to 18 or 60 above, but we'd have it in, all these different places. And again, just so many different iterations. And we were also just getting random PDFs from different groups. And so it was really a bit of a jumbled mess, right? So we needed to find an effective and efficient way to start tracking our members. So really what we wanted to do is simplify things, to consolidate the information, put it all into one place so that it's one true source of data. We wanted to eliminate any confusion or inconsistency. We wanted to ensure confidentiality, again, because an Excel spreadsheet is not the most secure. And we wanted to be able to update a single source as opposed to having to go to all these different places. So that was some of the reasoning behind getting one into place. Next slide, please. So, as we started researching the type of database that we wanted to use and get in place, we had to think about vendors, right? And how we might want to actually use that database. So, as I mentioned earlier, being both a public government and Indigenous government, we had to figure out, right, like who fits into the different categories of membership. And this matters because depending on your different type of membership, you have possibly different benefits or there are different implications for it. So for instance, in an election, somebody who is a resident and a DFN citizen, which is a legal term under our agreement, then you're able to say vote for both the chief as well as council members. However, if you are not a citizen but a resident, you can only vote then for a council member. So these distinctions are important to understand and to be able to identify who's who. How else do we want to use a database for elections, right? Just as I mentioned, you need to be able to find a place to put together a preliminary voters list, and having to pour over a bunch of different Excel spreadsheets is not the best way. So being able to just, click a few buttons and then poof, there you have it, which is really great, which we actually have used it for recently in a by-election as well as an election last year. We also like the idea of possibly being able to conduct elections online. We haven't done that yet, but we know that the technology is there to do it, which is great. In terms of education, we wanted to be able to say track who is going to school, levels of education that have been achieved, funding that's going to the students for that, etc. In terms of like employment opportunities, if we were able to say track that somebody has a certain kind of license or something to that effect, right, or has earned some sort of degree or who knows, then we can also then start seeing, all right, well, how can we fit that person into employment opportunities as they come up if they match up with that criteria. Communications, that's a real easy one. We want to be able to either send out mass or targeted messaging, right? And that's really easy to do now if you've got everybody in one place and you can, put together a list of emails based on whatever criteria you need. And so that's very helpful. In addition to that, too, if we have this portal that these individuals can use themselves, they can update their own information so that we're not having to track people down all the time. They can go ahead and go online and do that themselves, which is great. Again, back to the funding piece here, like just knowing demographics in your community is essential, right, for proposal writing or for participating in the collaborative fiscal policy process, as everybody here knows. And last but not least, of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but program and service development and management and tracking, right? So if you have a sense of the demographics in the community and education levels and skill sets and language abilities and all of that stuff, you can really start developing programs that meet the needs and desires of the community members. And then because you have all this information in one place, you can start tracking, right, how well those programs are doing over the course of 5 years, 10 years, or what have you. So that's another helpful piece. Next slide, please. There we go. So on to the selection of a vendor. We talked about the needs, right, that we had in mind when it came to picking a database, but we had to do a lot of research, and we had to do a lot of demonstrations with different vendors, and having to do those demonstrations over and over again with various, management or leaders, just to get that buy-in, right, that has to happen up front. So a lot of questions go into selecting a vendor, right? Do you want the vendor to be local, right? So you're supporting the northern economy. Do you want it to be pretty basic and therefore maybe a bit cheaper? Or do you want it to have a lot of different modules, say related to education or housing or, pick a thing, or the ability for it to grow over time so you can attach new modules, although that could get pretty expensive pretty quickly. These options, are they compatible with your current, finance department's software? Does it need to be? Do you have server capacity within your IT department? Do you want to own it? Do you want to subscribe to something that already exists? Like, what is the security like? What is accessibility like? Are you able to, give some people administrative controls and not others? And for what pieces? One big question that came up, which was scary, is what happens if you no longer want to use that particular product for whatever reason? how easy is it for you to get your data back and get it exported? I had heard a horror story of particular groups who had worked with whomever and had tried to move on to a different provider, and they were not able to get their data back. So that was a real big worry for me and a concern. So when I was doing the research, that was one of the first questions I asked. Other things that, to think about is we have for our language piece, like our own Dene font, are we able to incorporate that into the database as well, right? And, things like, do they provide training? Is that training included in the price? Is it extra? Is it done online or is it done in person? Are people available for on-call assistance? So these are all kinds of questions that we had to ask all these various vendors when we were doing that research. And once we did all of that work, it took several years, to be honest with you. We ended up selecting One Feather, and so we'll hear from Lawrence a little bit later about his system. On to the next slide, please. So once the vendor was selected, we had to do the work of determining who our members were. And as I mentioned, Deline is both a public government and Indigenous government. So what that means is that we have jurisdiction or lawmaking authority within our district over everybody who's in that district. So you don't have to be a DFN citizen or a band member or a land claim member for the Deline Gotine government to be able to use that authority. It's everyone who's resident in that district. So for example, if someone passed a law regarding education, it would apply to everybody. You wouldn't have two different streams of education, going in the community. So that meant that coming up with these various categories of members was actually a bit of a challenge. You can see my workboard here. This is actually the wall behind me was just full of stickies, and I had like a day or two of just like, okay, how does this work and who is what and how do they fit? And of course, I had to learn, right? I mean, like, how does this feed into the development of a framework, right, for this system, which is not really my background. So it was a real learning process for me. So we have to track, as I mentioned before, land claim participants. We have to track band members. We have to track people who are eligible to be either one. We have to track residents. We have to track residents who are members of other bands or who are members of other land claims. We have to track band members who live on other reserves, and et cetera. So it really was its own unique challenge. Next slide, please. And so once you figured out who you're tracking, you actually have to come up with a method of identifying those members. So unlike other groups who might be able to rely on, say, like a treaty number or a land claim enrollment number, because we're tracking these different categories of people, we had to come up with our own identifier. So you can see here some of the work that went into it. We now have, I believe it's a 10-digit number that identifies, are you a band member of sorts? Are you a member of the land claim? And then your own unique identifier at the end. So that was fun coming up with too, of course, with Lawrence's help. So another fun challenge. On to the next slide, please. Sorry, I don't want to take up too much time to make sure that Lawrence has enough time to get through his presentation. So what are we tracking? But the basic stuff usually, right? We've got the name, date of birth, contact information. We are still tracking, if you have a treaty number and what band you're with, enrollment numbers. But we started to ask other questions too that were more than basic, right? So we started to ask people about their language proficiency. So do they have a preference for English or Dene? Or, do you feel good about reading and writing in both, right? And so we track that as well. And I've put that into our system. In addition to that, we also, again, as I mentioned, talked about training levels, right? Education levels, and do people have other certifications and that sort of thing that we can start plugging in there. On to the next slide, please. And then this is my last one here. How did we collect the data? So as I mentioned, we already had existing pieces, of course, as piecemeal as they were. So we had all those various Excel spreadsheets, and we also get lists of our beneficiaries, our participants from the Sawtooth Enrollment Board under the land claim. We also then get updates from Canada regarding changes to our band list. And but of course, that doesn't cover everyone because we also have to cover residents as well. So we ended up doing a survey, creating a survey, and that was introduced at community engagement. So we were hoping to get as much participation as possible. We would introduce it publicly. We had it online. We sent it out in an email blast on Facebook. Please tell everyone it's for everyone. And of course, to sweeten the deal, we offered a $1,000 cash prize. So anybody who submitted a survey ended up being thrown into the draw and could win $1,000. And of course, that always helps. And once that was done, of course, there were still gaps, right, or people that we didn't get a hold of. So I actually had a summer student get on a list there and just cold call people that hadn't responded to the survey. And of course, there are still some gaps. We haven't tracked on everybody yet, but that comes with time. So I guess, yeah, all that data then at the end of it, collecting it all, had to be put into, again, one spreadsheet, because we had to find a method to be able to upload it into the database. And so that was my job, to painstakingly, line by line, put everything in, and it all had to be, unified and done just so. So that took a while, but absolutely necessary in our case. And at the end of the day, we're very, very glad that we did it. It's been an education for me and for my colleagues, and we're still pulling it all together and building it out. But as I said before, we're already using it for things like elections and for funding proposals and for talking about tax with the feds and whatnot. And we're just sort of looking forward to seeing how we can use it more and more in the future and build it out. So I think that's it from me, and I'll leave it to Lawrence to follow up.
Thanks, Jessica. So I understand I'll do my component as well, and then I understand we'll move through to questions afterwards. So thanks for the opportunity to be here together. One Feather, we're an Indigenous technology company based out of Victoria. We're 26 staff currently, and we do some work in various forms or another with over 280 First Nations across the country, providing a suite of services and everything from registry management through to electronic voting, to dedicated Indigenous banking or fintech solutions, and even status card renewal, and soon to be launched this fall, treaty annuity direct pay solutions right from Canada. One Feather is an Indigenous company. We are Indigenous owned and operated. Our board is 100% Indigenous, and we maintain specific metrics to ensure that our staffing remains mostly Indigenous and also of diverse backgrounds. Like I said, we're based out of Victoria, but our development team is actually spread out across the country. So we have folks that work here in our office and literally in every province across the country, as far east as Nova Scotia. And what we're really focused on here is redefining that Indigenous digital experience through innovation and tradition. So we are a technology company, and so we build digital technologies. And there's an element of readiness for these technologies in our communities, and every nation is different in terms of their readiness for that. But I think what everyone would agree on or does agree on is that the incorporation of digital solutions to advance our sovereignty and the way we do business and the way we govern is important and increasingly important, and adoption of those technologies and use of those in a good way, in a way that is relevant to our people, our communities, but also is not extractive and leaves that table better set. So, let's make sure that the technologies we're building are there to lift our people up, and not by accident creating another level of oppression or isolation or marginalization. So we really want to make sure that these technologies are useful in a way that helps build our communities. Or nation build, I think, is the context or the comment that's been, or the historical frame of how we as the heavy lifters in our communities help make our nation stronger. I'm going to focus this presentation mostly on the importance of the member registry and why that member registry is so important for First Nations and Indigenous communities across the country. Your registry or your data set around your members is really the cornerstone of exercising Indigenous sovereignty, but also data sovereignty, data ownership. And so as the world moves increasingly to this digital space, we're surrounded by digital data, or the ability to input and collect digital data. So how you as a nation consume that or curate that and use it in a good way for your communities will be unique to each of your communities and to your members and your people and your cultural and social kind of realities or current existence. And it's important that you have the ability to define what that looks like. So what was good for Deline may not be perfectly good for Clam. So, there has to be that ability for those registries to be curated in a way that makes sense to your communities. But the collection of that data or the use of that digital information inside that registry is so important. And using modern solutions to collect and manage that information is really, really important. And keep in mind that in that digital space, it's a two-way communication. It's a two-way process. It's never a one-way. So how we design or how you design that in a way that allows your members to be part of that digital relationship with you is really, really important. But understanding the benefit of that registry is beneficial because it can help you take that data and use that data. So not only do you curate and have access to that data, but you actually own and have sovereignty over that data. So any data you curate as a nation, any data you create is your data. You own it and you should have custody of it and you should use it in a way that makes sense for you. And you should be able to take that data and distill it down into things that make sense for your community. So funding applications, for example, if you have a pretty robust registry that's collecting current information around your members, and say it's a funding application for trades training or something like that, you can use that data to add a component to that application, for example, that makes it so more robust because you actually have current data that can back up the ask. And you can use it to create all kinds of other kind of pinpoints of really useful information that help you make better informed decisions around the scope and purpose of that application. You can use income data to make sure that the ask is correct in terms of training dollars, for example, and most importantly, kind of back up your arguments for why this application is important and why you need it now. So that registry and how you manage that and how you look after that is really the cornerstone of Indigenous sovereignty and nation sovereignty, and building that registry in a way that has a standard of input. So making sure that the registry itself, in terms of all the fields, for example, are useful fields and that the data can be extracted from those fields. And it may sound overly technically complicated, but it's not really. In the Deline example, we went through and broke down every field and gave it some form of indicator that allowed us to land at a 10-digit number. It doesn't have to be 10-digit. It could be 5, it could be 8, it could be 12. It just depends on your community. But that registry number tells us, many different data points of intelligence around that member that allows us not only to move that member through to appropriate resources and access to resources, but also allows the nation to pull out data instantly around that member when it's doing, any data analysis or taking a look at that data to provide context or reporting or information to leadership around who their members are, what their members are up to, what's important to the council at that time or the leadership at that time if they have questions. And the nice thing about a good, solid digital registry is that you can pull that information and it's instant and you always have it at your fingertips. So you're not relying on third parties or other parties to go do surveys for you or collect information. If you're using that digital space and that registry, well, you're collecting data all the time. You are refreshing that information on a regular basis, if not daily, at least weekly and monthly, so that when you need to pull information, it's always there and it's at your fingertips and it's current. Really, really important stuff. Why should you care? I think the opportunity exists right now for Indigenous communities to take ownership of how we define what digital registries or what registries look like from that digital perspective. And so if Indigenous folks are not leading the conversation and designing their own registries or their own data set or their own data sovereignty principles and packages, then someone else is going to do it for you. And then you don't own it. Then you don't have sovereignty. Sovereignty is about owning and having possession. So you may own data, but if you don't possess the data, you don't have sovereignty. So in the example that Jessica referred to earlier, where the nations had spent time in these previous organizations or other organizations collecting all this data and they think it's theirs, and then something changes and they can't access that data, they didn't have ownership of it. They couldn't pull it and take it instantly whenever they wanted. So sovereignty is not only about control, but also ownership and possession. So we want to make sure that, that you have possession of that data, but also that it's designed in a way that, reflects your values and your principles and your priorities. And each of your communities will define that. And taking the time to think about how that data will be used is really important, but also conveying that or communicating that out to your members and the folks who are participating so that you have a relationship with them around that data. And it's an interesting reality in Canada because Indigenous folks are the only regulated population in the country, right? So your citizens, your members have Canadian data rights, right? As Canadian citizens, they have data rights, and then the nation has data rights in terms of accessing that data and custodialship of registry information, for example, and then Canada has data rights that overlap in our members. And so you got to find a way to have that conversation or relationship with your members and make sure that it's permission based and that relationship solid so that your members have the ability to turn off or on their own personal data right access and sharing. And so understanding that when data is curated, so when that data is used to generate something, that you actually exercise ownership over that and you make it really clear about that. And respect your members' rights as well. But really the key here is, do it in a good way, design your registry in a way that builds relationship with your members and creates a space for them to participate and contribute. So for example, if they need to update their contact information, what's the portal, what's the mechanism for them to do that online or on their phone in a really quick and easy way? And then on the back end of that, how does the nation validate or verify that information so that it's updated to the nation's data system and it's validated, right? So that for example, only Susan with treaty number XYZ is able to update her information, not her grandmother, not her sister, not her child. So how do you ensure that the data sequence and how it's done can be verified and authenticated along the way? Because bad data in is bad data out. So make sure that the data going in is good data and create the processes there. There's a lot of technology behind the scenes and emerging things like AI and machine learning and other data management tools are there. We certainly incorporate those in everything that we do to make sure that data in is good data, and also ensure that your vendors, whoever they are compliant with federal regulatory requirements. So there are a number of federal regulations that they need to be compliant with. So it's good to know what those are. Yeah, and I talked about this, that data collection analysis facilitates the understanding and effectiveness and efficiency of benefits. So taking all that information in and then distilling it through a funnel and in whatever those checks and balances are, mean that what comes out the other end are an optimized release and distribution of resources and time and energy, equipment and money, right? Like our lives are all governed from an organizational perspective and even a business perspective by people, time, equipment, resources, and money. And so how are you using the data you're collecting to optimize the use of all those elements to maximize the benefits and services and solutions for your members? At the end of the day, it's about lifting our people up using this data in a way that allows them to feel like they're part of a community, but also access the resources they need or may be entitled to. And directing other resources in a way, again, that lifts our people up in our communities, and giving leadership the tools to make strategic decisions based on a number of data sets as opposed to anecdotal gut reaction stuff, which is really important because that often launches a conversation. And then the question is, well, what's the data that supports how I'm feeling right now? Or do I have bad data coming in that's making me feel this way? So again, that data, a good solid data outcome will really inform how you allocate resources. And I'm going to give you a quick anecdotal story around that. In One Feather, we have electronic voting, and one of the things that we often hear from our nation clients is that their elders won't be able to use, are not going to be ready for this technology. They're going to be challenged. And we're like, fair enough. And then we share with them the data we've collected over the last 10 years, some 300,000 electronic ballots cast, right? And what the data tells us is that members that are 18 to 38 use our systems and our electronic voting platform without without much support or need for assistance. It's intuitive, and fair enough, because we design for that demographic. That's who we build for. Interestingly enough, the next most successful demographic are our elders, 58 and older. And you know what the data tells us is they're the next most successful group because they use the resources that are provided. So they're of a generation that will read the instructions, they will read the support material, and when they reach out for help, they will have a focused question to assist them. So they're actually using the system quite well. In fact, they're the next most successful demographic. The caveat is they've never done anything online before, then all bets are off. And that applies to all age groups. If this is your first time using technology, you're going to be frustrated. But if that elder is using email or Facebook or Twitter or whatever it may be, talking with their grandchildren or their children, they're going to be able to navigate the platform really easy because we provided them the resources there to self-direct, right? They're a generation that solves problems. So they can go in there and solve the problem and they can get through it. Interestingly enough, the most or the least successful demographic are men between the ages of 48 and 58. And that's me. That's me. And the data would tell us they don't trust it, they don't like it, they don't want to use it, they don't like being told what to do, and blah, 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 blah. So, it just shows you that sometimes, our gut reaction to something is not always perfectly aligned because we've got some data that would make us feel this way, but other data would suggest other things. And so using both that anecdotal gut reaction to what's real, and then using data to support that or adjust how you deal with that problem is what we're talking about using this data, right? Allow you to target resources, realign how things are being used to optimize, and I'm not saying that all elders don't have any challenges, that's not correct, but optimize resources in a way that allow for the maximum lift in your community. Because at the end of the day, this data has got to add value, right? If it's not adding value and you're not using it in a way that lifts your nation up, what's the point in collecting it? So, that's really important stuff. But it is mission critical that you have some sort of data registry or some type of registry plan for you and your communities into the future. And it serves members, right? Improved service, focused use of resources, a greater accountability, better leadership decisions, and happier members. If your members can have a relationship with you around that registry in terms of collecting information, and so they give you something and you give them something back, right? So I'm going to give you my contact information. There better be a good reason for that. So how are you sharing information? How are you engaging them? And how is that relationship reciprocal? So as you know, any one-sided engagement usually deteriorates because there's no value for the other party. So when you think about your registry and you think about using digital technologies, how are you building a relationship around it? And I use that term intentionally, relationship. And a relationship means that it's two parties who have agreed to work together and are receiving mutual benefit from that. And so think about what that means for you and your community and how you can deliver that. And lots of resources out there to support you with that. So I'm going to take just the last slide here and just talk a little bit about what makes One Feather so special. So I get to brag a little bit about our company. So we are an Indigenous technology company, and this is what we do. We build the registries and we focus that registry around that digital identity credential. And I make the distinction around a credential versus a membership. So a credential is a digital credential that we've authenticated and verified through any number of true centers. And one of those true centers may be the nation itself, maybe Canada, maybe through a banking solution, maybe through a status card renewal, maybe through other forms. So in this way, we can create a membership or a registry that can satisfy any number of member types. Right. So maybe you are a First Nation. Maybe you have non-members who live in your community. Maybe you have, in the Deline example, folks that aren't even Indigenous at all, but are part of the governance framework of that region. And so we can start to create, you can have full access to that around that credential. And what that credential allows us to do is move folks through the system in a way that's tailored for them. So if we have members inside of Deline who are status Indians who need to have their status card renewed, they can do that directly through the platform. They can go in and renew their status card, right? But there's no point giving a status card renewal option to somebody who's not First Nation or not Indigenous, right? So those credentials allow us to, again, effective use of resources, allow us to move those members through the resources or through the nation benefits or through the governance structures in a way that makes sense for them, right? Move them around through the whole thing so they're not bombarded with things that are not relevant or don't mean anything to them, or worse, would cause confusion, or why am I here, what is this for, like I don't understand, because those kinds of distractions mean that they're not effectively using those systems. So I talked about that. What's the relationship here with the users? Make sure that it's meaningful, make sure that it's impactful, and that adds value. And so One Feather does that. And granted, specifically, we add value for Indigenous people, right? Status card renewal, access to through that digital credential, providing access to dedicated banking solutions. So, for example, if you're unbanked, you can create a digital bank account in a matter of minutes and have all the benefits of being fully banked. This fall, for example, we'll roll out other added benefits like treaty annuity payments. So if you're inside our ecosystem and you want to receive your treaty annuity payment at the beginning of each year, you can do that, as opposed to waiting for a treaty days or having to go up to an agent and demonstrate that you're part of the member and receive that cash. So One Feather is from an Indigenous delivery perspective, and that's our focus. We're really truly focused on adding value for our Indigenous brothers and sisters and communities across the country. Remove those barriers, which either by accident or design continue to marginalize, oppress, isolate, or discriminate against our people. So remove those institutional processes, take those things out of play, and just simply move our members right through to the benefit that they're entitled to have. Right. Another example that we hope to launch this fall will be GST and HST exemption. So if you have a GST or HST exemption and you're inside of our ecosystem and using our pay solution, you will experience a GST or HST exemption at point of sale, which means you just don't pay it. You don't have to self-declare. You don't have to fill out any forms. You don't need to show your status card. These things will just happen automatically. So those are examples. Those are the technologies we're excited about. When I talk about removing barriers to participation and removing barriers to access to entitlements, that's what we're focused on. And those are some of the things we're doing. And so at the end of the day, these are examples of how these digital technologies and a registry as a truth center can open up all kinds of benefits and access entitlements and services and programs that will lift your people up, not only through the nation itself, but in relationship with provincial governments and federal governments.